I moved into the area at 32, seeking a stable place to settle after years of apartment living. Crestwood Lane offered affordable homes and a peaceful atmosphere, appealing to young families like mine. Initially, the HOA's presence seemed unobtrusive. However, their rigid approach to regulation became evident when I decided to display a simple American flag on my porch for independence. The flag seemed like a harmless gesture. Yet, it quickly became a point of contention when Karen, clipboard in hand, informed me it violated HOA rules. The flag, in her view, was a breach of the association's strict guidelines, a rule I hadn't been aware of. This was my first indication of the HOA's far-reaching influence, and the beginning of the conflict that would follow. The issue wasn't just the flag itself, but the broader context of control that Karen and the HOA enforced across the neighborhood. The HOA operated with a strict set of rules, and their authority was rarely questioned. However, these rules often seemed subjective, selectively applied, and sometimes unreasonable. Karen's approach was methodical, enforcing compliance with no room for exceptions. She had a rigid vision of how things should be, one where anything outside of that vision was seen as a disruption. The flag, in its simplest form, was now an obstacle to her ideal order, even though it held no deeper meaning than a patriotic. Displayed from the moment I moved into Crestwood Lane, I noticed how tightly the HOA controlled every aspect of the community. It was evident in the little things, the way lawns had to be trimmed to a certain height, the bushes that had to be shaped in particular forms, the mailboxes that could not vary in style. The level of control felt excessive, especially when it extended to personal choices like decorations or even the color of house paint. Karen, in particular, seemed to take it upon herself to monitor everyone's adherence to these rules. She would often make rounds in the neighborhood, ensuring everything was up to standard. If someone put out a holiday decoration too early or forgot to remove it too late, Karen was quick to send a reminder. Her presence was constant and unyielding, her authority absolute. There was little room for anyone to challenge her approach without consequences. Her authority, though not always publicly challenged, was well understood throughout the community. This atmosphere of control began to wear on me. My initial decision to put up the flag seemed harmless enough. It was an expression of patriotism, nothing more. However, once Karen noticed it, I realized that it would be scrutinized under the same lens of conformity that governed the neighborhood. Her refusal to let anything deviate from the prescribed norms made it clear that no form of personal expression was acceptable unless it aligned with the HOA's narrow standards. After Karen knocked on my door, informing me that the flag was in violation of HOA rules, I felt an immediate sense of frustration. I had hoped this issue would be resolved with a simple conversation, but it became clear that Karen would not let it go. She explained that according to the HOA guidelines, flags were only allowed under specific circumstances, which I had not followed. She also hinted at further consequences if the flag was not removed, such as fines or even legal action. Though the flag was a modest symbol, it became a point of contention because it had violated the rigid expectations of the community's rules. At that moment, I chose not to engage in an argument. Instead, I decided to comply, albeit reluctantly. I took the flag down, but it wasn't out of submission. It was an attempt to avoid further conflict. However, the feeling of being pushed into conformity lingered. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a flag, it was about a system that operated on strict rules, without room for personal expression. I wasn't just feeling singled out. I was feeling like a participant in a system that rewarded compliance and punished individuality. I decided to speak with Ethan, a lawyer and friend of mine who lived a few streets over. I was unsure of how to proceed, but I knew I needed advice. Ethan was experienced in dealing with legal matters and wasn't one to shy away from standing up for what he believed was right. While the flag itself didn't matter much to him, the principle behind it did. After hearing the situation, Ethan encouraged me to challenge the HOA's authority, pointing out that the rules themselves were flawed. "This isn't just about a flag," he said. "It's about standing up for your rights and what's fair." He advised me to formally address the issue in writing, rather than simply accepting the HOA's power over personal decisions. Taking his advice, I drafted a letter to the HOA. In the letter, I explained my reasons for displaying the flag and emphasized that it was a peaceful, non-disruptive act of patriotism. I argued that the display of the flag was not in violation of any major community interest and that enforcing such a regulation was excessive. To make my case stronger, I attached pictures of other homes in the neighborhood that displayed various forms of decorations, some of which I felt were far more intrusive than my modest flag. The idea was to show that there was inconsistency in how the rules were being applied and to highlight the arbitrariness of the HOA's enforcement. I waited, hoping for a reasonable response. However, the HOA's reply was not what I expected. Instead of acknowledging the points I raised, Karen sent a formal letter back, reinforcing the original position and threatening further action. The letter stated that if the flag wasn't removed, I would be in violation of HOA rules and the police would be called. I was taken aback by the severity of the response. A simple flag was now being treated as a legal matter. This letter was the breaking point. I could no longer accept being bullied into compliance. It wasn't just about the flag. It was about the arbitrary enforcement of rules that stifled personal expression and choice. The HOA's response was disproportionate and unnecessary, and it became clear to me that I had to stand my ground. I wasn't going to be pushed around by an organization that operated with such rigidity at this point. I knew that I could either continue to comply and let the HOA dictate every small aspect of my life or challenge the system. I chose the latter. I wasn't certain of the consequences, but I felt it was time to make a statement. I took a deep breath, put the flag back up, and waited for the HOA's next move. Whatever happened next, I was prepared to deal with it. The situation escalated rapidly after I decided to put the flag back up. The HOA, led by Karen, clearly did not take kindly to my defiance. My assumption that the matter would simply fade away was mistaken. It became apparent that the HOA was unwilling to back down, and Karen was determined to make an example of me. Rather than addressing the issue in a reasonable manner, she resorted to enforcing the rules with increasing aggression. The first indication that things had taken a turn for the worse came when I received a formal letter from the HOA. The letter stated that my flag was still in violation of HOA guidelines, and further stated that failure to remove the flag would result in an official intervention by law enforcement. It was clear at that point that Karen was not only enforcing the rules, but was using her position to make the conflict more public and more serious than it had to be. The letter suggested that police involvement would be the next step, and this was no longer a simple disagreement. It had turned into a legal matter. The day the police arrived, I was caught off guard by the gravity of the situation. I had expected the HOA to continue sending letters, or perhaps escalate the issue in some bureaucratic way. But the arrival of law enforcement signaled that the HOA was pushing for a resolution, even if it meant involving the authorities. The officer who arrived was calm but firm. His presence made the issue feel much more official, and I could tell he was there to enforce the complaint made by Karen. Karen accompanied the officer, seemingly satisfied that her efforts were coming to a head. She had escalated the matter by involving the police, and her demeanor suggested that she saw this as a victory for her and the HOA. She didn't speak much at first, but waited for the officer to explain the situation. The officer's explanation was simple. The HOA had filed a complaint regarding the flag, and my display of it was deemed a violation of their established rules. The officer stated that he was required to intervene due to the complaint. At this point, the conversation shifted from being about the flag itself to a larger discussion about authority, fairness, and the enforcement of community rules. The officer, though polite, made it clear that the HOA had requested his involvement, and he was simply carrying out that request. It was not a question of whether the flag violated any laws, but whether it violated the HOA's internal rules. He didn't express an opinion on the matter, but instead focused on the necessity of enforcement. The interaction with the officer felt more like a formality than an actual resolution of the conflict. There was no genuine discussion about the fairness of the rule or the reasoning behind it. The focus was solely on compliance. The officer's stance, while neutral, suggested that he was just doing his job, with little regard for the nuances of the situation. The rule had been violated, and his presence made that violation feel more tangible, more real. Karen seized the moment to reiterate her position. She explained the specifics of the HOA's rules, emphasizing that the flag could not remain unless it adhered to very particular guidelines. Her tone was not one of reasoning, but of finality, as if the rules were unchangeable and the situation was already decided. She had already made her judgment, and now, with the backing of the police, she seemed confident that her interpretation of the rules would carry the day. In response, I chose not to back down. I acknowledged the officer's explanation, but took the opportunity to express that the issue at hand was not simply about a flag. I explained that the broader principle of fairness was at stake. The HOA's enforcement of the rules felt selective and arbitrary, and the flag, in my view, was being used as a tool of control rather than as a legitimate violation of community standards. I stood firm on my position. I was not going to apologize for displaying the flag or for exercising my right to make that choice. I felt that the matter had spiraled out of control. And this was no longer about the flag itself, but about standing up for fairness in a system that had grown too rigid. The officer, while acknowledging my perspective, reiterated that his role was to enforce the rules as they stood. He suggested that further escalation could be avoided by complying, but he also understood my desire to address the broader issue. His response, though sympathetic, reflected the reality of the situation. The HOA had the authority, and the rules were in place to be followed, regardless of personal opinions on their fairness. It was at this point that I proposed an alternative course of action. Instead of continuing down the path of police involvement, I suggested that the matter be taken up with the HOA board. I recommended that we hold a meeting where the fairness of the rules could be discussed openly and where everyone could have a say in the matter. This, I believed, would provide a chance to address the underlying issues with the HOA's regulations, rather than continuing to escalate the conflict through enforcement. Karen, however, was not interested in such a resolution. Her frustration was palpable, but she remained silent, unwilling to engage in a meaningful discussion. The officer, seeing that a potential confrontation was brewing, decided that it was time to leave. He warned me that he would continue to monitor the situation, but for now, there was no immediate action. As he got into his car, the message was clear. The HOA was not going to let this issue go easily, and it was only a matter of time before they would act again. Karen, standing there in silence, was no longer the confident figure she had once been. Her authority was being challenged, and though she said little, the shift in her demeanor was evident. She wasn't used to being confronted, especially not in such a direct and public manner. I, too, had gained a sense of confidence. I realized that Karen's authority was not absolute, and I was no longer intimidated by her actions. Though the situation was far from resolved, the dynamics had shifted. I was no longer the one on the defensive. The conflict was far from over. But at that moment, I had made it clear that I wasn't going to back down. Following the incident, the conflict began to shift as the community became more involved. News of the flag issue spread quickly through Crestwood Lane, and conversations began to take place among neighbors. While some supported Karen's stance, believing that the rules were clear and needed to be enforced, a growing number of residents began to see the issue from a different perspective. Many, including Ethan, understood that the conflict was not simply about the flag itself. Rather, it represented a larger issue of how the HOA wielded its power over individual rights and personal choices. These neighbors realized that the HOA's approach to enforcement was overbearing and lacked consideration for the community's values. Ethan, being a vocal supporter, began encouraging others to join the conversation about fairness and the proper role of the HOA in community life. People who had previously kept to themselves, not wanting to get involved in neighborhood politics, began to question the extent of the HOA's authority. The more the issue was discussed, the clearer it became that the HOA's rules were not always applied equally or fairly, and that this situation highlighted a need for change. When the next HOA meeting arrived, I knew it would be a critical moment. Karen had made it clear that she was still determined to enforce the HOA's regulations, and it was expected that she would continue to argue her point. However, I had prepared to present my case, not just about the flag, but about the broader issues of fairness, respect for individual expression, and the balance of power within the community. I had spoken to several neighbors who were equally dissatisfied with the way things had been handled, and many were now ready to voice their support. At the meeting, I presented my concerns directly to the board. I argued that the HOA's rules, while intended to maintain order, had become a tool of excessive control. The flag was merely the catalyst for a larger conversation about how the HOA operated. I highlighted how some regulations felt unnecessarily restrictive, stifling personal expression, and creating an atmosphere where residents were hesitant to voice opinions or push back against authority. I stressed that the purpose of a community should be to foster inclusivity and collaboration, not rigid conformity. As I spoke, I noticed a shift in the room. Several neighbors who had previously remained quiet during HOA meetings began to speak up in support of the points I was raising. Some shared their own frustrations with the HOA's overreach, while others acknowledged the need for more balanced rules that considered the diverse interests of the community. This collective support was something I had not anticipated. But it was clear that many residents had been silently dissatisfied with the HOA's level of control. Karen, who had been prepared to defend her position with her usual authoritative tone, found herself on the defensive for the first time. As I continued to speak, it became increasingly clear that her rigid stance was losing traction among the board members and the community at large. She attempted to respond, but her arguments lacked the support they once had. The board members, once aligned with her, now appeared divided, and Karen's usual certainty seemed to waver. In a surprising turn of events, the board voted to remove the restrictive rule about flags altogether. This decision was a significant shift in the HOA's approach, as it represented not just a change in one regulation, but a broader reconsideration of how the HOA would interact with the community moving forward. The vote was a clear indication that the community no longer accepted the authoritarian control that Karen had exerted over the years. With the rule repealed, I was able to put my flag back up without fear of reprisal. But the real victory was not in the flag itself. It was in the broader change that had taken place within the community. The events surrounding the flag had sparked a shift in the way the residents of Crestwood Lane viewed the HOA's authority. People had begun to question the previously unquestionable, and the atmosphere had shifted from one of passive acceptance to active participation and engagement. Karen's position of control, which had seemed so unassailable before, had been eroded. Her leadership had relied on a system of rules that were rigid and selectively enforced. With the repeal of the flag rule, the foundation of her authority had begun to crumble. The community was no longer intimidated by her tactics or her threats. It was clear that change was not only possible, but necessary. This transformation was not immediate, and there were still lingering tensions within the community. Some residents remained loyal to Karen and her methods, but many others recognized the need for a more democratic and open approach to governance. The HOA began to reevaluate its rules, focusing on inclusivity and fairness rather than control. The defeat of the flag rule was only the beginning of a larger movement toward change. The event demonstrated that the community could come together, question authority, and push for a system that respected individual rights while still maintaining order. For the first time in years, residents felt empowered to participate in the decisions that affected their lives. This was a shift in power dynamics that had long been overdue. Ultimately, the flag incident was not just about a piece of cloth, was about reclaiming a voice in the way the community was governed. It was about breaking free from a system that prioritized control over collaboration. And in the end, the community of Crestwood Lane was stronger and more united as a result. In the weeks following the HOA's decision to repeal the flag rule, the dynamics within Crestwood Lane underwent a significant transformation. The events surrounding the flag had sparked a broader conversation about authority, fairness, and the role of the HOA within the community. The formerly unquestioned leadership of Karen was now being challenged, and her hold on the HOA's reins began to weaken as the community reflected on the past. It became clear that the rigid control exercised by Karen and the HOA had been a barrier to open dialogue and fairness. Residents had grown accustomed to the status quo, where rules were enforced with little regard for individual perspectives. The flag incident, however, exposed the limitations of this approach, and many began to question whether the HOA's power was being used in the best interest of the community. Karen, recognizing the shift in sentiment, eventually stepped down from her position as president of the HOA. Her resignation was not sudden, but rather a result of mounting pressure from the community and a loss of confidence in her leadership. In her place, a new leadership team was formed, one that prioritized transparency, fairness, and inclusivity. The new leadership was committed to revising the HOA's policies, ensuring that they reflected the values and needs of the residents rather than simply maintaining control. For me, the decision to put the flag back up was symbolic. It was not merely an act of patriotism, but also a personal statement about standing up for what was right, regardless of how small or insignificant the issue seemed. The flag, once a point of conflict, had become a symbol of resistance, change, and empowerment. It represented not only my individual rights, but also the collective power of the community to challenge an unfair system. The resolution of this conflict marked a turning point for both me and the neighborhood. The community had come together to question the rules that had previously been seen as unchangeable. What had started as a small act of defiance had grown into a larger movement for fairness and accountability. It showed that sometimes even the smallest actions could lead to the most profound changes. In the end, the experience proved that the true strength of a community lies in its ability to support fairness, inclusivity, and collaboration. The flag incident, while initially divisive, ultimately brought about a positive change. The community had learned the importance of questioning authority, standing up for personal rights, and ensuring that all voices were heard. It was a reminder that fairness should always take precedence over rigid control, and that change, even in the smallest of ways, could make a lasting impact.